Welcome to the Center Square Radio Hour for the first week of April 2025. I'm your host, Chris Krug. The Center Square and the Radio Hour are projects of the Franklin News Foundation, a 501c3 independent, nonprofit, nonpartisan news service. Established in 2019, the Center Square Newswire publishes original taxpayer-centric straight news, focusing on the size, scope, and effectiveness of local, state, and federal government. On the Center Square Radio Hour, our journalists explore their top stories and add insight to those headlines. We'll also present thoughts on the economy from Dr. Orphe Divounguy, PhD economist. Today, we'll look at President Trump's tariffs. We'll hear about the results of a few significant elections in Wisconsin and Florida, and we'll discuss climate change lawsuits. We'll be right back with all that and more in the Center Square Radio Hour.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the Center Square's reporting zeroes in on state authorities publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. The Center Square gives power to the taxpayer by tracking politicians' use of the people's money and demanding transparency from state-run agencies. This is how the Center Square equips you, the American taxpayer, to hold your state government accountable. Sign up now for your state's Center Square newsletter at thecentersquare.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on this week's tariff rollout, it's Dan McCaleb.
President Donald Trump this week enacted sweeping new reciprocal tariffs on countries that place such taxes on U.S. imports. The move drove stock prices lower, but Trump says the short-term pain will be followed by an economic boon of new jobs and investment and fairer trade. Joining me to discuss this is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, let's start with the specifics on the tariffs. What is Trump doing here?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on who you ask, but what Trump says he is doing is he is leveling the playing field on global trade. He says for a long time, other countries around the world have taken advantage of the U.S. They have tariffed us. Even some of our closest allies have had tariffs on us, and we just let it go because we're America, because we're rich, we're wealthy. And as other countries have tariffed us and we've refused to do the same to them, manufacturing in the U.S. has just precipitously declined. And now we don't make much here anymore because we make it in other countries. And in those other countries, they pay often slave wages. They have, no safety protocols. It's very dangerous to work in these countries. And by the way, they totally destroy the environment because they have no, hardly any environmental regulations. The benefit of that for Americans is that they can buy very cheap things. The downside is the environment's destroyed. People die making it. They work in slave, wages, and American manufacturing, it can't compete with these people who are basically, making slave wages. So, Trump's saying we're going to put tariffs. It's going to, increase prices for Americans. There's going to be some pain is the word he used, although I'm not sure how much he would acknowledge the prices are going to go up. But the trade-off on that is that long-term companies will have an incentive to build in the U.S. because it won't be so cheap to just build something in a poor country and import it over here. Actually, this week, a couple of countries have basically removed or lowered their tariffs against the U.S. So Israel's one, and then Vietnam cut their tariffs. They had very high tariffs. And so that's part of the other side of this reciprocal tariffs idea is that, yes, we tariff people to the degree they tariff us, but it's possible that long term we both get rid of the tariffs because they have an incentive to get rid of their tariffs because there's a lot of reasons for that. So because they're paying a price too now. So everywhere from some of our allies like Japan, we're putting tariffs on them now. South Korea, another huge ally. Taiwan, we're tariffing them. We import a lot from them. Of course, the EU, China, the United Kingdom. And then there's other countries that, maybe aren't as close of an allies, but we do import a lot. Places like, Brazil and Pakistan. And, there's a long list, and you can see, that actually there's some reporting at thecentersquare.com. We have a chart in Brett Rowland's story that lays out all these different tariffs, but there's many countries being tariffed now. And, it's possibly going to bring in a lot of money too, to help raise revenue for the federal government.
Yeah, I get the feeling this is not a short-term game, but a long-term one. And just to fully evaluate what these new tariffs are going to mean, it's not something that we're going to know in a week or a month if they continue, unless other international countries decide to lower their tariffs on U.S. goods. We're not going to know the true impact for quite a while. Would you agree with that?
I would. And I think these deals are going to be getting negotiated. This basically sets the stage for a lot of trade negotiations, a lot of deals being made. And also, it's going to take time to see whether these promises of more domestic manufacturing in the U.S. really come to fruition. I mean, we're not going to see that in a week. It's going to be, really decades to, it takes a long time to build a factory and then start producing. And it's going to take even longer to build, several factories, enough factories to reinvigorate parts of the country that used to be manufacturing hubs and are no longer. Now, with that being said, just because we get more manufacturing doesn't mean it's going to be in the Midwest where it used to be. There's benefits for being in the Midwest, but that's not necessarily where everything's going to be. The economy's changed a lot. There's new tech hubs in the U.S., places like Miami, like Austin. So tech manufacturing could very likely go to places like that. But, like you said, time will tell. I mean, building out a whole new manufacturing base will take time.
So Trump's message is patience, I think. Of course, in the short term, as we wrote about at the centersquare.com yesterday, we're recording this on Friday morning. By the way, yesterday the Dow dropped 4%, NASDAQ 6%, S&P 500 fell 4.8%. So markets haven't opened yet today, but they will soon. We'll see how it goes there. One underreported part of these Trump tariffs, Casey, that you wrote about had to do with what's known as the de minimis clause. Can you explain what that is to our listeners and what the impact is?
Sure. So for years and years, Chinese companies have been allowed to ship small packages into the U.S. and not pay any taxes or import costs as long as the package was less than $800. And so there's actually millions and millions of packages. I think it's like 4 million packages a day coming to the U.S. from China that don't pay any fees to come across, to come into the country because they're considered less than $800. This will come from companies like Temu, like Shine, or Shein. I could be saying that wrong, but Temu is a big one. And, you might buy some headphones that may or may not work, and you ship them from China, right?
And these are companies that compete directly with U.S. based companies like Amazon, right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And, there's a House committee studied this issue, specifically studied, the Chinese government in 2023 released a report and said that basically these companies are so intertwined with slave labor. The different products are made with, wages that are not really a living wage at all. And so, the price, it's really come to the forefront that the price to buy, cheap headphones made from China is that the people that made them are basically slaves, that they destroyed the environment. And by the way, it puts American companies out of business who can never compete with Chinese slave labor. I think we've always known this intuitively and thought it was kind of weird, even as kids, that everything just said made in China or made in Taiwan on it. But that's how it's been. And then the other thing, J.D. Vance, the vice president, has been talking a lot about this and a few others, is that it's possible we're about to go to war with China. I mean, we've been on the verge of war with China for many years. And the moment China attacks Taiwan, we're going to be at war with China. And turns out a lot of our stuff is made in a country that we're about to be at war with, possibly. And how is that going to work when our prescription drugs are made in China and now we're at war with them? I mean, there's a real question of some of these essential goods like prescription drugs, microchips and certain metals. And there's a lot of things that you really need. One, just to survive as a country, but two, especially in wartime to survive. And we rely on many of those things coming from China.
Well, thank you for joining us today, Casey. This is certainly a story that is ongoing, will be developing, and listeners can keep up with it and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Dan and Casey. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on state-level elections in Wisconsin and Florida, it's John Stife.
There were significant elections on Tuesday night. I'm here with regional editor Steve Wilson to discuss what happened in both Florida and Wisconsin. Steve, first of all, can you tell us about what happened in the Florida special elections?
Well, there was a lot of out-of-state money poured into two special races that replaced a pair of representatives that sought positions in the Trump administration. And one of the positions, obviously, Matt Gaetz was nominated for AG. That didn't work out. But Mike Waltz is now the national security advisor for the Trump administration. So you had the remaining terms for those two reps. And of course, that wouldn't be a big deal if the House wasn't as close a majority as it is. They were at 218, which is the minimum to control the House. And these two victories pushed them 2 over. So you got a little bit of wiggle room there.
And in Wisconsin, Steve, kind of not typically, the state Supreme Court race ended up getting a lot of national attention. There were a lot of reasons for that. Part of it is some of the items that are going to come up in front of the court, coming up, and it got a lot of attention. Everyone from Barack Obama to Elon Musk put a bunch of money into it. Donald Trump was tweeting about it. It garnered a ton of national attention, which isn't normal for a race like that. It had a lot more money spent on it than a race normally did. And somewhat surprisingly, on the night of the election, it didn't end up being as close as we thought, or as close as the polls had shown. Susan Crawford, who was the Democrat-backed candidate, ended up winning pretty handily, and they were able to declare it well before all the final ballots came in, because in Wisconsin, the final ballots generally come in Milwaukee County and Dane County, and both of those are Democrat areas. And they do kind of a central count there, and then at about 1 a.m., they get this last huge batch of ballots. Sometimes it can change the result, but this time it wasn't going to.
I think it's a case of who gets their voters out. Obviously, in Wisconsin, they got their voters out. And in Florida, even though turnout was way down, you had not even 200,000 people voting in each one of those congressional districts, whereas in the presidential elections, you had more than 400,000. So you had a smaller electorate. But I think in these special elections, they're hard to do, because you don't have as much runway to raise money. You don't have as much runway to get your name out as a candidate, because as we've seen so many times, name recognition is key and candidates are key. One of the things that was interesting in Florida is Jimmy Patronis, the chief financial officer, pretty popular guy, Panama City businessman, perfect fit for the first district. Former state senator and state rep, Randy Fine, not as much. He hardly even raised any money, and Trump and some notable national Republicans had to come in and save him. And what's interesting too is he and Governor DeSantis have a lot of baggage between the two of them. They don't like each other.
And something that happened in Wisconsin was that, it wasn't a special election like you're talking about in Florida, but there was much higher turnout than the normal local elections and the normal spring election cycle. Some places in Milwaukee even ran out of ballots. They had to quick rush couriers over to 7 different precincts to get more ballots. And they kept telling people, hey, if you're in line before 8 o'clock, make sure you stay in line, because you can vote. The ballots will arrive. But there were a lot of people who turned out for this election compared to normal. And what we will probably find out later is that the breakdown was interesting on who was able to get people out to cast their ballots. A lot of people there was also a head of the education department, the K-12 education department in Wisconsin. And a lot of people said, well, a lot of the unions ended up getting a ton of people out for this election, the election that usually gets about half as many people as the presidential elections. So that skews the results, both in the judge race and in the Department of Public Instruction race.
I think too, in Florida, I think there's this whole they're trying to nationalize things, and that has its uses, but I feel like, and I know this is a big cliche, all races are local. And I think you can't really divine some sort of portend for the midterms out of these 3 races. I just don't, because you look at, even though Randy Fine got outspent by Josh Wheel by almost 10-1, most of it from out of state, he still beat him by more than double digits. Not as good as before, but I've done a little bit of analysis, and I've found that first-time candidates running in a congressional race, even if it was just a regular race, they still don't do as well as the previous incumbent, because you don't have that name recognition. And it's one of those things where with Randy Fine and Jimmy Patronis, once their name recognition gets in there, they start serving the district. People start to know them. They do town halls. Their numbers are going to ease up, and because they're in like the deepest of deep red districts. Same thing with Wisconsin, which is, let's just be frank, a mostly blue state.
Right. And in the Wisconsin race, there was a Marquette poll maybe 2 months ago that showed that none of the candidates had much name recognition. And one of the people that did was Brad Schimmel, who was in the judge race, and he was the former attorney general, and he wasn't reelected. So there was kind of maybe the electorate didn't love him. Either heading into it. So he had some name recognition coming in, and maybe it wasn't all positive.
And I think too, that one of the things that's difficult about these kind of races, obviously with the Supreme Court race, that was just to replace a regular vacancy. And I have never in my time covering politics ever seen a state Supreme Court race draw that kind of money, that kind of national attention. We're seeing a black swan event when it comes to state Supreme Court races. But these two House races, the thing that I find fascinating, I think Josh Weil ran a really good campaign, good ads about, hey, the Republicans are threatening your Social Security and your Medicare, and they kind of had to push back on that. But in the first district, they ran a woman, Gabe Velamont, who was a gun control advocate. I've spent a lot of time in the first district of Florida. I can tell you, everybody has a gun. Everybody has a pickup truck. That goes over about as good as a vegan hamburger.
Steve, thanks a lot for your time. And you can read more about the elections at thecentersquare.com.
A big thanks to Steve and John. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Back with more on climate change lawsuits. It's Dan McCaleb.
Blue cities and states across the U.S. have filed a series of similar lawsuits attempting to make oil and gas companies pay for the cost of climate change. Critics say these lawsuits are on tenuous legal ground because of a 2011 U.S. Supreme Court ruling and because proving direct causation is nearly impossible. Joining me to discuss this today is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, you wrote about these lawsuits this week, particularly on one filed by Bucks County, Pennsylvania, north of Philadelphia. Tell our listeners more.
Yeah, this is a really interesting story. This has been going on for over a decade. It's just now starting to come to a head. But over a decade ago, local governments, cities, counties, and in some cases, a few states filed lawsuits against some of the biggest energy companies in the country, the big oil companies that we would all recognize. And they hired these law firms to do it. And what they said was they want the oil companies to pay, there's not always numbers attached, but you could imagine we're talking hundreds of millions, probably in all the lawsuits total, we're talking billions of dollars. And what do they want the money for? They say that basically the oil companies have caused climate change and they need to pay billions of dollars to help fix it. It's called an abatement, where they do things like build a seawall to prevent against the rising ocean levels. There's other things that environmental groups would say could help ameliorate the effects of climate change. But basically they're saying these oil companies are responsible and they have to pay these huge sums. Now, this comes at a time when President Donald Trump is calling for more oil and gas drilling, for more domestic exploration. And of course, these lawsuits don't incentivize that at all. If drilling in the U.S. could get you hit with a couple $1 billion lawsuit, you could get blamed for global climate change. That doesn't incentivize it. Now, what opponents of the energy companies say, they really focus in on in their lawsuits that the oil companies, they say, knew that climate change was happening for a long time and didn't do anything. And they say that the oil companies like deceive the country and that they knew this was coming on. Now, the oil companies and their, partners say that, hey, we have followed, federal law to the letter. We don't break federal law. The federal government, Congress created an extensive, elaborate regulatory structure through the Clean Air Act and other regulations that say there's thousands of laws that we have to follow to make sure that the climate's taken care of and the environment's taken care of. And we follow all of them. And if Congress, wants to pass more laws to make the environment safer, then we'll follow those too. But when we've followed all the laws, how can you sue us? We've done everything that Congress has said we're supposed to do. That's kind of their defense. There's more defenses too we can get into, Dan. The example, like as you mentioned at the top about the tenuous legal ground and how you exactly prove causation, but that's the groundwork.
Right. And this idea that you can prove direct causation? For example, Bucks County government, which brought this particular lawsuit, they bought gas-fueled vehicles for their employees and had their employees drive them around, right? They've been using different forms of electricity or whatever going back decades. So how do you directly assign a specific percentage of blame to something like the oil and gas companies when individuals and governments have been using fossil fuels for decades?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's impossible. And that's part of the problem. Now, there's no doubting that, it's pretty much widely accepted and the Clean Air Act exists because we know that there have to be regulations and restrictions in place to protect the environment. And those, as I said, are followed. So it's not as if there's an argument for just let emissions run wild and do whatever you want. But the idea that you can prove that one individual oil company or a group of oil companies are responsible for the exact CO2 emissions that then caused specific effects, it's very difficult to prove. For instance, China releases far more emissions than the U.S. does, right? And so we pretty much shut down all our coal for it, but they were building multiple coal power plants, dozens every year, new ones, right? And of course, that, the air reoccurrence is taken all over the world. So we have Chinese pollution here in the U.S. Absolutely. We had, because it's carried over in the air. And so, the defense is, how can you prove that what caused the damage here isn't Chinese pollution or some other country, developing country, Indian pollution, or, there's Brazilian pollution? These developing countries are really starting to expand their energy industry. So how can you prove that? And then, by the way, how can you prove that the pollution actually caused real damages to Bucks County? Can you prove that this lake is gone because of air pollution or whatever it may be? Those are some difficulties legally that they're navigating. Another one is, how can you bring a lawsuit against someone when you don't have any one individual who's been harmed? So, in a legal battle, normally you have to have an individual, a plaintiff a person who is injured, right? You have to prove that you are the one who's willing to both bring this lawsuit. So like, Dan, you and I could not, sue the government of North Carolina for doing a bad job distributing FEMA aid after the hurricane. Maybe they did do a bad job, but you and I were not personally harmed by that FEMA aid distribution. So we cannot be the ones to bring the lawsuit. We don't have a cause of action. We can't be the ones to bring the lawsuit because we were not personally damaged. You have to find someone in North Carolina if you wanted to sue FEMA. You have to find someone in North Carolina and prove that they were injured or suffered somehow because of FEMA's alleged malpractice, and then go from there. So how do you find, with that, legal framework in mind, how do you find an individual who has been damaged by climate change enough to where they could sue? And the answer is you really can't. So they have to take this other legal route called public nuisance, which is kind of unusual. It's in the Supreme Court in 2011 basically ruled that you could not bring, federal, common law public nuisance claims. I know it's kind of technical. But they struck this down. Now, the people who are bringing the cases say, well, that only applies to federal, law. It doesn't apply to state law. And so that's a big legal question. It's a big constitutional question. There's a good chance it could end up back in the Supreme Court on that question alone, let alone the merits of the case of if you can prove these oil companies are responsible.
Thank you for joining us today, Casey. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thanks to Dan and Casey for that update. After the break, we'll look at more top stories from across the nation. What is the Riley-Gaines Act that passed the Georgia State Legislature? What is the Washington State Attorney General's office relationship to Perkins-Coie lawsuit against the Trump administration? And is a decline in supply or demand driving price growth? All that and more when we return on the Center Square Radio Hour. Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. Here are this week's quick hits, some of the original reporting you may have missed at thecentersquare.com. Illegal border crossings reached a new low in March. The 2025 total is down 94% from 1 year ago. Trump administration border czar Tom Homan said the new total for the entire month of March is less than figures reported for one day at times during the Biden administration. The trend is so pronounced that migrant facilities have started to close. A bipartisan group of lawmakers says U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement agencies should know when a non-citizen becomes a criminal defendant in Pennsylvania. The one-page bill cleared the state Senate on Monday, 31-18, with 4 Democrats joining the chamber's 27 Republicans in a yes vote. Senator Wayne Langerholt Jr., a Republican from Johnstown, said the legislation's simple language reaffirms that being in the country without permission is a crime. It also means that defendants would be transferred to federal custody for deportation. A Monday executive order from President Donald Trump seeks to establish a new government office to assist companies looking to invest more than $1 billion in growing their businesses in the United States. According to the order, burdensome government regulations impede both domestic and foreign business expansion, and the office, designated the United States Investment Accelerator, is meant to help with that. The office will be housed within the Department of Commerce and will help investors of more than $1 billion navigate, quote-unquote, regulatory processes efficiently, reducing regulatory burdens. Federal district judges need a rebuke from Congress before clarity in articles of the Constitution, former House Speaker Newt Gingrich told two subcommittees in a congressional hearing. His answer came in response to U.S. Representative Reverend Mark Harris, a Republican from North Carolina, asking about legislative steps needed to, quote, address the problem of activist judges acting beyond their constitutional authority, end quote. The University of Michigan is ending its diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, immediately closing both the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and the Office for Health, Equity, and Inclusion. School administration officials said the programs are being ended in response to recent executive orders and federal guidance from the Trump administration that are beginning to, quote unquote, reshape higher education. Moving forward, the university said it plans to shift student-facing services previously in the closed offices to, quote, other offices focused on student access and opportunity, end quote, while also increasing its investments in those services. You can find more on these stories and others like them from across the country at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back with more on the Center Square Radio Hour.
Some people would call him a loser. He ran for state office. He was beaten. He started a business. He failed. He ran for Congress. He lost. He was nominated for vice president. He lost again. But he knew only those who never tried are the real losers. And Abraham Lincoln was no loser. Persistence. Pass it on. From the Foundation for a Better Life at values.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on the Riley-Gaines Act out of Georgia, it's our Eliana Kernodle.
The Georgia General Assembly sent the Riley-Gaines Act to Governor Kemp's desk. Joining me with more on this story is the Center Square's Kim Jarrett. Kim, can you tell us how this bill got started?
This actually was the first bill filed by the Senate during this legislative session. It is Senate Bill 1. They filed a bill basically that would ban transgender women from participating in women's sports and also would separate male and female in locker rooms. Later on, the House came up with a different version of the bill, which was basically the same. They called it the Riley-Gaines Act. There was a big change in the House bill that did not make it into the final version. It would have codified the words male and female and given definitions of those throughout the state code. The state code is basically the law book that they use to if you're going to look up a law, that's basically the state code. That was included in the House bill. So what usually happens in the Georgia General Assembly every year is the Senate's going to introduce a version of what they want and the House will introduce a version of what they want, basically on the same topic, and they'll come together and they'll create one bill. And that's what has happened with Senate Bill 1. They have come together and created a bill, and the Senate agreed to call it the Riley-Gaines Act, which was the name for the House version of the bill. Maybe that's a little confusing, but that's kind of the logistics of how we got here this week.
Can you get a little bit deeper into what this would do if it does pass?
So I think sometimes what doesn't get talked about enough, and we write a lot about these transgender bills and participation in sports. We talk a lot about them and it's a big national issue. But the thing is, what happens if it's violated? I don't think that people talk enough about that. So what happens in Georgia if it is found that a school or a sports team is in violation of the law? Basically, there will be an investigation. This isn't going to be something where they find out that you are violating this provision of the bill and they're going to say, oh, you can't participate. It doesn't work that way. There is an investigation. It could go, the bill is a little vague it could go, I think, up to 4 years, but there would be a lengthy investigation and the school system or the team would be given an option to comply with the law. And if they refuse to comply, that's when we get into what the penalties are. The State Board of Education could determine they're going to withhold state funding from that entity. And it's going to be based on what the board determines is sufficient to make sure the school complies with the requirements of the law. Also, the team that is in violation, they could not compete. If there's a ruling, they would just not be able to compete in any other sports, or basically the sport that they're accused of having a transgender participant in.
What was some of the conversation around this bill as it was making its way through the General Assembly and after it passed?
Well, it packed committee rooms. Committee rooms were packed as this bill moved through the Senate and the House. A lot of the conversation was that there are not that many transgender athletes in Georgia. Some people said there were fewer than 1% of transgender athletes, that transgender people are not trying to play soccer, football, basketball, etc. And they feel like they were unfairly being targeted when it is an issue that very rarely happens. Some of the lawmakers who are in favor of the bill were challenged to say, do you know a transgender athlete? And many of, they're like, well, no, not really. They really couldn't answer that question. So that's where, and then two people saying this is a human rights thing, that, why are you not wanting them to participate? They talked about the benefits of school sports with children and with college athletes and how beneficial they are. And why are you trying to take this right, they called it, away from them? So that it was big. After the bill, this is just one of several bills that the Georgia legislature is considering involving transgender people. So last night at the Georgia General Assembly passed a bill that where prisons cannot authorize sex change surgery for inmates, and Democrats walked out of the debate in the House. They just got up and walked out. So these transgender issues have been extremely volatile, and we've had a lot of heated debates in Georgia during this session of the General Assembly.
So what can we expect going forward?
Well, Governor Kemp is expected to sign this bill. And a lot of it, this started on the national level. President Trump issued something similar to what states are considered. But he's expected to sign this bill and it will go into effect. It could be challenged in court. That's too soon to tell. But most of these bills, I've covered other states that have these bills passed, and most of the time they are challenged in court. So just because Kemp signs it, a judge could issue an injunction saying, well, we want to put the effective date on hold until we have time to move this through the court system. But there's pretty much no doubt that Kemp is going to sign it.
Well, Kim, thank you for your insights on this story. If you want to read more about it, you can follow it at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Eliana and Kim. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on legal and ethical questions surrounding the Washington State Attorney General's office, it's Spencer Pauly.
With me today is investigative reporter TJ Martinell. Today we're talking about his recent story regarding the Washington Attorney General's office supporting a private law firm that has filed a lawsuit in response to executive orders from President Donald Trump. But TJ, you uncovered some major details about Brown's relationship with this law firm that is leading to some legal violation complaints. So let's just get right into this. Tell us what you learned.
Right. So as you mentioned, Perkins Coie filed a lawsuit and they sought a temporary restraining order against President Trump's executive orders regarding their security clearance and federal contracts that the law firm has with them. Our state attorney general, Nick Brown, filed an amicus brief, which is effectively a friend of the court brief to the judge, saying that Perkins Coie's case was important for them to get involved with, along with 20 other state attorney generals. And though they mentioned in the amicus brief that they had occasionally had Perkins Coie suing the state, what they failed to mention is that they have an active contract with Perkins Coie right now that is set to expire in September to provide legal services to Washington State University, which is a client of the Attorney General's office. Now, why that's relevant is the contract makes Perkins Coie special attorney generals, and by that, an extension of the Attorney General's office. So, in effect, Nick Brown was filing an amicus brief in support of his own office.
So a state attorney general filing an amicus brief in support of, a private law firm like this seems unprecedented. Would you say that's true?
Well, it's also unprecedented in that they filed an amicus brief in support of a private law firm like this regarding a temporary restraining order. According to one of my sources, the only time this has happened in recent memory was concerning illegal immigrants, children being caged or kept separate from families, I believe is what happened.
So it was unusual and unprecedented for them to get involved in the first place. Now, to be fair, it's not illegal for them to do so, but the problem is that they failed to disclose that they have a conflict of interest in getting involved in this case. So they're not a neutral party.
Right, right. And so the Attorney General's office has contracted with this law firm. Do you know how much they've paid in legal fees already?
I'm trying to figure that out. I filed public records requests. This is not just one of the most largest private law firms in the country. It also, they charge a premium for their services. They're, a very prestigious law firm in that sense. So they're not charging minimum wage per hour on this stuff. So we don't know. We also don't know. Here's a couple things we don't know. We don't know how many other, if any, active contracts that the Attorney General's office has with Perkins Coie right now. We don't know how many contracts they've had in the past. We also don't know if they had any contracts with them at the time that law firm was also suing the state, in which the Attorney General's office would be representing. But here's the irony of the amicus brief arguments is that Nick Brown was saying that just because Perkins Coie had previously represented Hillary Clinton, they were involved in the Russian dossier incident that's been since disproven. And the idea that they were basically opposing this notion that the federal government can terminate contracts with a law firm. So they're saying that the client has to accept an attorney. Well, here's the irony of that. In the contract signed between the Attorney General's office and Perkins Coie, the Attorney General's office can terminate the contract under any circumstances and for whatever reason, as long as they give them a 15-day notice. On top of that, Perkins Coie also has to notify the Attorney General's office if they plan or intend to represent a client whose interests are adverse to the state.
They haven't considered any of that. They haven't considered terminating this contract just because of this, or
no. But that provision is the very thing that they're going after President Trump over.
I see.
They're going after President Trump because he doesn't. They're saying he has to give better reasons than the reasons he's giving for not continuing the contract with them. So that's the issue that's going on. And the other issue that's going on is that Perkins Coie has to notify the Attorney General's office if they're plan to represent a client whose interests are adverse to that of the states. In effect, what that's saying is, hey, don't represent people we don't want you representing, or we could potentially terminate your contract. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, how many other contracts do they have where the same stipulations apply?
That is definitely something that, you think of when you see all these details in the story. Now, in your story, you also talked to former King County Deputy Prosecutor Bob Scales. Now, what did he tell you about, Trump's orders and this whole entire, situation?
Right. So for my first story that I wrote about this, he said that there's no legal basis for them to oppose him terminating contracts. Like, this is kind of the most basic fundamental right of a client to no longer work with an attorney because you don't think that they're representing your best interests. And it's kind of bizarre for them to say, hey, this law firm that represented your political opponent, you have to have them represent you as a client, and you don't have a right not to seek legal representation elsewhere. Mm-hmm. So he just said there's no legal or constitutional basis for it. And he's got his own opinions as to what's going on. But I mean, from a taxpayer perspective, what's effectively going on is that the Attorney General's office is using public taxpayer dollars to help protect the federal contracts of a private law firm that it has a contract with at the same time.
That's something I thought about too when I was reading your story. It's like, we're having state tax dollars being used to suit federal tax dollars. And TJ, this is what we do. We cover taxpayer focused stories. So I'm always thinking about like that kind of aspect of it. But when you see it on paper here, it's like tax dollars being used for this, it can grow some frustrations. Now, TJ, did you reach out to the Attorney General's office about all of this, especially when you found out this new information?
Yeah, I reached out to them and they got back to me and said that it was not illegal or against anything for them to file an amicus brief. That's part of what they're allowed to do. Regarding the contract that they had with Perkins Coie and the failure to disclose it, they were as silent as the Red October.
Okay, so what's next, TJ? What's next in this process here?
Well, there's been an ethical and legal complaint filed at the state and federal level over this. And so I've reached out to some sources. I actually reached out to the U.S. Attorney General's office for the District of Columbia, which is where the lawsuit was filed, the temporary restraining order. And I didn't hear back from them. I'm not sure what's going on there, but I've reached out to other sources. So this is a developing story. So this is, believe you me, it ain't over yet.
I bet. Yeah. Well, I think with all of what's going on here, but can we just go back real quick? Because the law firm Perkins Coie, they filed a lawsuit against Trump regarding one of his executive orders. Now, I'm not sure if we touched on it, but can you tell me which executive order this is? Just because he has, issued so many. Which one was it here? Do you recall?
I don't recall the exact executive orders. I just know that there were several, and they're also accusing Trump of defamatory remarks, which Bob Scales has told me doesn't make any sense because the president has immunity from that kind of thing. So the president can say kind of whatever he wants. And so that's kind of what's going on right now. I mean, there's the temporary restraining order has been imposed, but the lawsuit is still ongoing.
Always complex with these lawsuits. Well, TJ, I know you've been keeping a close eye on these upcoming events. So thanks for briefing us on the story.
Thank you, Spencer and TJ. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Joining me to discuss personal consumption numbers, consumer sentiment, and inflation, it's PhD economist Dr. Orphe Divounguy. Dr. O, we got some economic data that I think sort of like, the harbinger data around inflation, the personal consumption expenditures index, which is a kind of maybe like a technical term for the stuff that we buy index, up, what was the number? 0.4%?
That's right. Consumption growth, personal consumption expenditure up 0.4% on the month. Personal income up 0.8% on the month, and core inflation surprised on the upside. Core inflation was up 0.4%. This is up from 0.3% last month. And on a year-over-year basis, we are looking at core inflation at 2.8%, a slight uptick from the 2.66% that we had a month ago. So I think that's the problem, right?
Well, let's call it timeout because we went through, there's like, when these numbers, like when this report in particular comes out, I mean, there's a lot of connective tissue here. So what do these numbers mean? I mean, what's the easiest way to distill this?
Look, if price growth is accelerating,
okay,
then the big question is, okay, do we have a decline in the supply side of the economy, or an increase in the demand side of the economy, or both? Right. And so that's the way to just break it down very simply. And, it seems that we have a little bit of both. Policy uncertainty acts like a supply shock. It gets businesses to pull back on spending, right? In investments. Businesses pull back on the hiring workers. They pull back on producing a bunch of stuff because they're like, well, we don't know what's going to happen next. And then consumers usually tend to pull back. So you get a little bit of demand, easing back. But then if consumers begin to suspect that prices are going to be higher in the future because of all this tariff talk, right? Some consumers might actually think, hey, it's better to get my stuff today than to wait until prices are higher in the future to go and buy stuff.
All right. So pre-show, you said that. So I have to ask this question. Do you think people really think about things in those terms, or do you think that just PhD economists think about?
Well, look, all you got to do is look at the U.S. consumer sentiment numbers.
Okay.
We know that consumers.
That number came out today, and that number, right. And again, we're recording this on it's Friday, March 28th, right?
Yeah.
Pretty much at the end of the month of March here. And I mean, the sentiment was bad. Like the worst that the number's been in 2.5 years. I mean, it goes back to 2022. But that's a sentiment, right?
Well,
I mean, and
the reality is consumer spending had dropped last month. It rebounded, but it rebounded less than expected. So to me, what that tells me is that, you still have consumers kind of on edge. they're on edge not only because prices are stubbornly high and it's going to be difficult to keep up, but they're also on edge because their income prospects are dwindling. The job market is, employment growth is lower.
Yes.
Hiring rates are at a decade low. And even though we haven't seen a big increase in layoffs yet, it's very difficult. If you're unemployed, it's very difficult to find a job right now.
I was flipping through. Okay. And on that vein, I was flipping through LinkedIn because you had mentioned, I don't remember what it was. You mentioned something to me and I went to LinkedIn to look at it.
Yes.
And there was a story on there and I believe it was in video form, but the grist of the story was this, that people who are looking to change jobs right now should not be expecting significant wage increases or any wage increase necessarily if they're changing jobs. So, I mean, that's all right. That's in LinkedIn, right?
Yes.
So it
is
certainly more white collar, right? I mean,
yeah.
But I mean, but why? I mean, why would you change jobs if you weren't going to be getting maybe you had.
And exactly. And that's why the quit rate is so low.
Yeah.
People are not changing jobs. They're not changing jobs anymore, because employment prospects are falling. There's just not a lot out there. Now, if you add to that, federal government job cuts, and you have a lot of unemployed workers, newly unemployed workers adding to this pool of job seekers. And yes, there's just not enough employment to go around for this group. And so like the competition among workers is so high that, and at the same time, you combine that with the fact that hiring rates have fallen, right? The demand is just not there. Then you have a cooling labor market. You have a loosening of the labor market. Wage growth is likely to continue easing. And then if you have stubborn price growth because of tariffs and retaliation, et cetera, well, guess what? Your purchasing power decreases as a consumer, and that's going to cause consumer sentiment to plummet. And we're seeing it already. So that's kind of what there is to say about this report. It's not positive. It's not positive for the consumer. It's not positive for the Federal Reserve that was hoping that, right. So the last thing you want at the Fed is growth to slow, the unemployment rate to increase, and inflation to increase at the same time. Remember the dual mandate. What we'd like is for inflation to moderate, come down slowly.
Yes.
And if growth is falling at the same time, right, then that would mean the Fed could actually cut interest rates to help stimulate the economy. But if inflation is rising and the unemployment rate is rising at the same time, what is the Fed to do? It is kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Appreciate your thoughts as always, Dr. O. That'll do it for another week of the Center Square Radio Hour. Miss some of today's show, you can find it wherever you find podcasts. I'm Chris Krug. On behalf of everyone at Franklin News Foundation, thank you for listening to the Center Square Radio Hour.